I would like to introduce our two respondents to Kelly's presentation on setting the stage as to what we have in the region. Ms. Rachel Sims Seeley is the General Counsel, Corporate Secretary at the Trinidad and Tobago Securities and Exchange Commission. She is an attorney at law specializing in banking, corporate finance, trust, and corporate law, and she has previously worked with a regional financial group, a leading law firm, and a state enterprise in Trinidad and Tobago. She has also served as a part-time lecturer in the Department of Management Studies at UWI St. Augustine. We also have Mr. Marlon Marie from the OECS. Marlon Marie is the acting head of the unit at the Competitive Business Unit of the OECS Commission. He's an IT consultant and he oversees all e-business initiatives on behalf of the OECS Commission. And this includes working closely with governments, SMEs, NGOs to ensure that the proper framework for economic development through e-commerce is in place. So let me pose a question to Rachel. So Rachel, Telly has set the stage for what's happening in the region with respect to the opportunities and also what's available for in terms of alternate financing. She has mentioned throughout, particularly in the part with business financing, that a lot of the reasons, one of the basic reasons, some of it has not gotten off the ground in any real way in recent times, but she predicts that things will be happening, is the whole element of trust. And that's a cultural issue, right? I have always been a big thing with culture, and we've often heard that if you want to change culture, you have to change behavior. And you have to change that behavior over a considerable period of time in order for the culture to change. So in your experience, what are some of the things that could be done to accelerate the change that is expected for the uptake of some of this alternative financing within the region? Because if we are, as in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, to diversify and to diversify quickly into the fintech space, into the technology space, there are some basic things that have to be done. So what's your take on that?
Okay. Good question, but let me just give a little background in terms of what fintech regulation in the Caribbean, what's been happening. I've just come back from a Caribbean group of securities regulators conference that was held in the Bahamas from Monday to Wednesday, and fintech was a big part of the discussion. How do we regulate it? How do we understand it? Because it seems that the proponents and market actors are a bit of a step ahead of the regulators in this forum. So that is a big issue, and there is going to be regional collaboration on it. I'd also like to highlight to Telly that the Bahamas actually has draft crowdfunding rules. They don't call them that though, for regulating equity crowdfunding. So they are contemplating encouraging that in Bahamas. The other regulators in the Caribbean don't yet have any crowdfunding rules on the equity side or the lending side, but they will be coming soon. We are working to collaborate to come up with a Caribbean-based type regulation. So right now, most of us are still in the research stage of trying to understand these, not just crowdfunding, but the other fintech products. I think we understand crowdfunding probably a little bit better than some of the other products. We've noted the approaches in some of the other developed countries where crowdfunding has really taken off. In the US and Canada and so forth, we're looking to see what they're doing and the effect of their regulations, which are probably a year or two old, on their crowdfunding market. So to get to your question about trust, one of the key ways that we can develop trust is by investor education. You're not going to trust what you don't understand. So I think as regulators, we recognize that we have a role in imparting that knowledge. These are these products, these are how they work. And these are how we can distinguish between a legitimate, innovative type product and something that is really a Ponzi scheme, as we would have heard earlier on with the, was it OneCoin? How do you then distinguish between the legitimate products that are really encouraging innovation and the one coin. So we have to identify for ourselves as regulators, these are the markers of a legitimate product as opposed to what is really a fraudulent or illegitimate type product. And we have to get that knowledge out there. And that is something that we are also working on as as regional securities regulators. So that is, I think, one way. In terms of the other aspect of trust is the international aspect, you know, in terms of the AML CFT aspect of it. And we need to make sure that these products are not really being used to launder money or to finance terrorism. And as regulators, that is a big concern for us. But we have to balance that against we have to meet our international requirements. All of us are governed by the CFATF, the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, and there are certain regulations and requirements there for us to register products. There are certain aspects that we can't get away from. But then at the same point in time, some of those very regulations are kind of why people are running maybe from traditional forms of financing to the fintechs. And we don't want to recreate that and basically shut it down before it even starts. So that balance, that Goldilocks regulation, as they call it, is something that it's going to be a challenge for us in the Caribbean.
Marlon, what's your comment on that as well?
Well, for us at the OECS Commission, we have started the dialogue with the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. So for us, we do a lot of policy development, and regional integration is one of our main focuses within the OECS because in numbers we have strength. So for us, we're trying to have this dialogue, and we're starting to speak about things like introducing certification authorities in terms of looking at secure transactions. And when we start talking about secure transactions, we can start to build that trust. So currently we're in negotiations to have a project within the OECS. Our total population together is 1 million strong, and that's with the inclusion of Martinique. And coincidentally, this project is being pushed by Martinique and our French counterparts because they realize that the framework within Europe is very strong. So for us, we are trying to influence that culture from this side.
All right, so at this point, we can open the floor for questions. Any questions? Any comments? Okay, so let me ask another question. All right, so there's work being done at the regulatory point and at the policy development point in terms of a regional approach. But how do we get that down to how do we bridge that gap between what is happening at the policy and the regulatory point to the young guy who has an app, who, as we heard yesterday, somebody developing peppers in a granny's kitchen. How do we get to the point where they are or somebody's comfortable to invest in that small guy, or he's confident enough to go out on the web and ask for to build his whole thing around crowdfunding? How do we get to there?
Okay, so the OECS Commission last year, we actually embarked on some crowdfunding training, coincidentally. I believe we trained over 600 persons across the islands, and that would have included the schools. We went into the community colleges, and we introduced the concept of crowdfunding. We introduced all the different models, and based on the feedback that we got, the young entrepreneurs, they are interested in getting access to finance. Looking at our overall approach to innovation and technology, our Director General came up with this idea to highlight and work with 30 entrepreneurs within the OECS. So we've recently launched a 30 under 30 program where we actually receive about 130 applications from young entrepreneurs across the OECS. So what we try to do is to have a holistic approach. If we are doing some policy work, we're now trying to do direct implementation. So we are at the stage where we are now assessing the applications that we have, and we'll be doing some shortlisting very soon. I'm happy that process, and I'm hoping that we can get some real good products and services coming out, and we will be doing additional training for them and seeking access to financial resources for them as well. So we're trying it from different angles.
Okay. Telly, you still there?
We're just unmuting her.
Oh, okay. Telly?
I'm here.
Right. You've heard the comments made by Marlon and Rachel. Do you have any comment to make in terms of one, in your experience and your research, adding to combating the whole issue of trust and also aggressively moving from policy and regulation out into the actual implementation and getting a crop of entrepreneurs seriously looking at the alternative source of financing. Any comments there in terms of the implementation point?
From an implementation point, I do agree with Rachel in terms of investor education. I would have alluded to that. That is definitely missing. And investor education is very critical because, for instance, when you look at the peer-to-peer platform that's InfoLink, that actually works cross-border within the OECF. You find that persons who are the investors may not necessarily have investor education. They're doing it because, on the one hand, you have some feel-good projects that they might want to support. On the other hand, they do it because they compare the whole issue of, from a rudimentary basis, if I put $1,000 in this project, I'm going to get back 20% returns. I'm not going to get that in the bank because the bank's giving you 2%, if so much, these days. So they're looking at it as a way of leverage, but they still are not really, when you look over time at their behavioral patterns, they're not really as savvy. So that's very key. Or they don't even see themselves as investors. Because last year I had an event, try to call out investors. On the one hand, someone came to tell me, oh no, they don't want to show their hand. They don't want people to know that they actually lend money. So you have that issue, again, of lack of trust. And then on the other hand, they might not see themselves necessarily as investors. They see themselves as helping somebody else. So that is very key from a practical perspective. And I think collaboration with private sector and investor education and the universities is also key and important. Also, the new methods and mechanisms for investing. Again, it will be different when you're investing on a platform versus when you're investing in an early stage startup and investing on an exchange. So that also needs to be a point. On the issue of trust, and again, it's the issue of trust will be dealt with education, but also the issue of trust can also be dealt with through just general training, not necessarily on investor education, but training, especially when you look at entrepreneurs, because we're seeing it in some of the other programs we participate in, where entrepreneurs also are risk averse and afraid of sharing what they're doing, and the startups sharing what they're doing because they're afraid people will steal their ideas or so on. So again, education on that perspective on innovation and how to innovate, because no idea is unique. The ideas are basically, you could Google an idea and you can find the same idea, but the key is on execution. So entrepreneurial training is critical. So it's not just on the supply side investor. You have to also deal with it on the entrepreneurial side. So more of an ecosystem approach. From a regulatory and policy perspective, I think I hear you in terms of doing the research and so on, but I think we tend to have paralysis analysis. And by the time you start to figure it out, the technology has actually evolved. Because right now, people are doing peer-to-peer lending on blockchain, on alternative currencies, cryptocurrencies. And again, where you've learned that is not issued by any particular central government, and you have certain exchanges that allow you to move from crypto to fiat currency. So when this is happening, you're still trying to figure it out by analyzing it instead of getting into the game. So one of the ways a lot of the regulators in other countries have done it is by actually setting up labs and working with private sector and also the same entrepreneurs in terms of having them engage in these sandboxes and labs to create things, because that way you can get to understand what the policy implications are, what the regulatory implications are, as you see it happening. By stepping outside and looking in and saying, okay, well, I see the innovation, let's just research it. It's not going to work unless you're part and parcel and partnering with the stakeholders involved. So I think moving forward, while we agree, maybe for some innovations, they kind of move faster without regulation. But then again, if regulators are involved, because your role is really to create an enabling environment and enable it further, I would say rather than stopping it, is rather than creating a lab and working along with the stakeholders. That's the best way to do it. A lot of the central banks have done that. Central Bank of England has done that. They even launching their own pilot programs on, using these technologies like blockchain and so on, to see how they can actually use it to solve issue. I didn't get to really present the last part, which is called RegTech. It's called RegTech for a purpose, because now you have a rise of using technology to kind of address some of these regulatory and compliance issues that might be very burdensome for a person to do it, a single individual or manual process. So that's the opportunity I think I've covered.
Okay, thanks.
Those three areas.
Okay, Telly, thanks for that. I see Dr. McNaughton, you had your hand up.
Right, so just looking beyond the technologies and the platforms for both panelists, do you have any thoughts on why we haven't been able to engage the diaspora in a serious way as investors in startups and entrepreneurs? And is that part of the conversation at all in this sort of regional discussions that you're coming from? Both institutional or otherwise approaches to the diaspora community, something that becomes commensurate with the inflow of remittances, but we're just not seeing it on the investment side.
Okay. In terms of I'm coming from the perspective of a securities regulator, so it's not necessarily our role to encourage that per se, but it is from that side in terms of the use by the investors. I think that role has to really be taken up by the governments, regional governments, the regional universities and so forth. What we have to do is when we see it, we have to encourage it and make sure that our regulations don't stifle what is really necessary for the growth of the region, because we are seeing, even in Trinidad here, with the lower oil prices, we're now hurrying to play catch up to try to see what we can do to encourage other sectors. And this is our opportunity. So it is hoped that with forums such as these, that the right people will be listening and encouraging. Just also to mention that I've heard a lot today about sandboxes, and we discussed that also at the conference I'm coming from. And that is part of the approach that we're envisaging. We're not just looking to see how to develop regulations, because as Telly said, by the time we develop the regulations, the technology would have changed. So we recognize that. And I think a lot can be done, but I think we have a collective action problem in the region. We've seen it with the CSME and CARICOM, and we're hoping that that problem can be overcome with these, in dealing with these types of technologies. I mean, I know the regulators are certainly willing to do what they can, but in terms of being the driving factor, I'm not sure if that necessarily is their role. So.
Okay, and for the OECS Commission, we have actually recognized that there is a huge possibility and potential for us to work with diaspora. And interestingly, our engagement in crowdfunding was initiated through the diaspora and a report done through the World Bank because we recognize that there is potential for businesses and for businesses to grow. We already have our economic union where we can move freely as persons and to establish businesses within the OECS. And we recognize that the diaspora has access to lots more resources than we may have. So yes, we recognize this, but at this stage, we're hoping that we can do more and more engagements, go through the different social groups that are established in the diaspora, etc. So for us, it's important, and we're hoping that, you know, once we get opportunities, we capitalize on the opportunities that we have.
Okay, Shiva, you had a comment to make?
Just from the regulatory perspective from the SEC, what is stopping me right now from starting a crowdfunding platform? Is there anything?
All right, so if depends on the type of crowdfunding platform. If your crowdfunding platform is donations-based, the SEC does not regulate that. If it is equity-based, right now you would unfortunately have to try and fit into one of our existing rules. The platform most likely would have to try and register as a broker-dealer. I think someone mentioned before that under these existing rules, until new rules are developed, we're going to have to look to see what exemptions would apply, because a crowdfunding platform is going to be very different from the traditional broker-dealer. So exemptions probably could be sought and for limited periods until these rules really come on stream. So it can be done, even within the existing legislative framework. And I think the message we need to get out there as the SEC is that we don't want to stop you from doing certain things. We want to perhaps encourage it even, but until we have a specific regulatory framework, come and work with us. Come and speak to us. I mean, I've only had 1 or 2 applications in the last year. It turned out one of them was definitely donations-based crowdfunding, which we didn't regulate. But it's something we would like to encourage because we recognize the potential to assist the economy and so forth. So come to us, and we will have to see how to fit you all into the existing regulatory framework by making exemptions as necessary. And most of the regional SECs, their boards have the power to make exemptions from rules once there's sufficient backing for that. So I'll see. I'm not sure. I think that other one wasn't really crowdfunding. It was more a kind of robo-advising type operation, and I think they're still in discussions with that particular person, both in Trinidad and Jamaica, because it was meant to be a kind of cross-jurisdictional robo-advisor. So again, most likely it will be registration as a financial intermediary with some exemptions. So.
Okay, any other?
Your question up the back here.
Hi, Agri-Marsh, GSL. I wanted to know, were there any AML CFT challenges from the OECS side or in Trinidad with allowing these kinds of software and platforms to work in the Caribbean?
Okay, so I'm aware of one crowdfunding platform in Barbados, and in order for them to get off the ground, they actually did do some anti-money laundering stuff. Basically, in order for them to get onto PayPal or accept any form of payments, you would have to go through that entire process. So there is that check and balance. because we don't regulate it in the region, and they have to go through these platforms, they must do some work.
Okay, any other comments from the floor? Okay, if not, we can wrap up this session. I would like to thank Telly Onu, who's right now in Germany. Thanks for being with us this morning on the remote. I'd also like to thank Rachel Sims Seeley, and Marlon Marie for being part of the discussion, for stimulating the whole thought process in terms of what more we can do in order to accelerate the whole issue of financing for the alternative, as an alternative means to get our entrepreneurs in the region off the ground. So with that, I thank you all for participating, and move on to lunch.